This video is sponsored by Raycon. It's easy to assume that a slasher flick with the title Prom Night will likely be gimmicky seasonal schlock. However, much like its spiritual Canadian sibling My Bloody Valentine, you might be surprised to know that Prom Night is not entirely what it appears to be on the surface. While yes, it is ultimately a pre-Formula 80 slasher in its final third, when it drenches the glitz and glamour of its vibrant disco gymnasium in unrelenting vicious obscenity, the hour-long build to said titular Prom Night is actually a remarkably somber slow burn misdirection that lingers more on the sinister ubiquity of the male gaze. Despite that mouthful, it's definitely far from the most exciting slasher flick, but it makes up for it by being a perpetually uncomfortable exercise in mystery and suspense, as it takes many of its shifty beats, eerie obscurities, and eventual fits of violence from Black Christmas and Halloween. Prom Night broadly tells the story of a group of high school students who were stalked and murdered by a mysterious masked assailant who seemingly seeks vengeance for their involvement in the death of a 10-year-old girl when they were kids just 6 years prior. However, there's a bit of a curveball thrown in there when the local lieutenant attempts to intervene after a psychotic sex offender accused of killing the girl pulls a Michael Myers and escapes from a mental institution, murders some random girl, and is now seemingly on the hunt for the pure thrill of it. If I'm honest, it's a rather oddly delivered story. It's filled with red herrings, withheld information, and just a general lack of clarity, and I genuinely cannot tell you if that's a good thing or a bad thing, although at the very least, it is interesting. I would argue that Prom Night is presented as deliberately incidental. It puts us in an ordinary, uneventful suburban setting where everyone is just going about their everyday lives absent of drama, oblivious to this murderous shadow that gradually looms over them. Instead of giving us a true, apparent central protagonist like most slasher flicks, Prom Night is actually made up of small, low-key characters who each have their own independent narrative arcs that are largely irrelevant, or at least might be, to the central conflict of the story. Of course, we do have Jamie Lee Curtis as our resident Scream Queen and Leslie Nielsen before he went into full comedy territory, but as significant as they are to the main plot, they sort of fizzle in and out of the film as if to intentionally blend in with the other characters as not to be seen as conventional leading heroes per se. As such, some of these narrative arcs don't exactly go anywhere or provide anything necessary to the plot, yet what is broadly compelling about them is that not only do they help to develop each unique personality, they also build a real sense of community with how natural and interconnected the various relationships are. It paints a vivid and relatable picture of this quiet, innocuous town, which in turn makes the inevitable rampage feel more real and devastating, especially with the rising distrust and weariness we begin to feel when suspecting who the killer might actually be. Yeah, as I said, this isn't going to be your typical slasher flick, but at the same time, trust me, it does reward your patience because for as simple as the killer is, and for how little we actually see of him, it is a pretty intense outcome, and it is also understandably very campy. As always, as we go along, and yes, I will share my thoughts on the 2008 remake at the end, if you have a recommendation for a future video, please tell me about it in the comments below, and if you want to get access to uncensored ad-free versions of these videos, please consider checking out my Patreon. And now, a quick word from this video sponsor, Raycon. Sometimes after a long day of work, I like to get comfy on the sofa and play some video games, but it's thanks to the lightweight design and amazing audio quality of Raycon's everyday earbuds that I'm able to perfectly immerse myself in the atmosphere. Their quick, accessible Bluetooth connection makes it effortless to just plug in and play, and with optimized gel tips to make the earbuds the right fit for me, I never again have to worry about the hassle of constantly adjusting them until they're comfortable, because once they're in, they never fall out. In fact, with the addition of 8 hours of playtime and a 32-hour battery life when using their compact charging case, rarely is there ever a reason to take them out, especially when keeping myself distracted during a long tattoo session. Raycon everyday earbuds start at half the price of other premium audio brands on the market, and with over 48,000 5-star reviews, there is no better time like today to get a pair for yourself. Simply click the link in the description box below or go to buyraycon.com/Ryan to get 15% off your order. And if you do so, let me know what you think. And now, back to the video. So, if you go into Prom Night with only the slasher plot in mind, the film's strange and chilling opening can feel relatively out of left field. It leaves this uneasy impression that persists for much of the runtime, as we see a group of kids, soon to be our future victims, playing a game of hide and seek in a dilapidated school, where the sinister twist is that they appear to be role-playing as killers hunting for their prey. It honestly would not surprise me if this opening greatly inspired Wes Craven's approach to the creepy nursery rhyming kids in Nightmare on Elm Street, because besides the whole loss of innocence theme and the possible symbolism of kids playing in a dead, dilapidated school, you could say there's this lightly fantastical sense of mourning and unrest that carries over following what comes next. Eventually, the group of kids bully a young girl called Robin into accidentally falling out a window to her death, prompting agreement never to tell the truth about what happened, as someone apparently witnesses the entire incident from a distance. The thing is, Robin's death doesn't just become the catalyst to the killer's implied motive, it also becomes a looming shadow itself, as her father, Mr. Hammond, and siblings Kim and Alex are still left emotionally shattered on the 6th year anniversary of her death. However, what makes this anniversary poignant to them is this pondering about a life that never was, one cut short by a childhood tragedy, because had Robin still been alive, this also would have been her prom night, which itself is arguably a symbolic gesture of the end of an era in teenage high school life. In many ways, Prom Night was arguably one of the earliest slashers to implement the morality play, where begging for redemption, forgiveness, and innocence will not protect you from a force of evil that simply doesn't care and seeks to replicate harm purely for its own desire. Psycho absolutely deserves credit for actually pioneering the slasher morality play decades before slashers were even a thing, but the point is, Prom Night isn't just killing for the sake of killing. There's a superstitious undertone that bad deeds must be punished, that the invisible moral barrier that makes kids off limits in horror movies has to be broken, or at least that's the killer's desperate attempt to justify motive, but we'll come back to that later. It's important to remember that it's not as simplistic as these kids deserve to die. It was unquestionably an accident. It doesn't frame them as bad people. It's the lie or lack of truth that becomes the symbolic gesture that paints a target on their back. The thing is, despite the tragic accident, the 4 eventual victims are essentially harmless when compared to the other nasty individuals who deserve greater comeuppance. One scene in particular that stood out to me is when a guy attempts to coerce a girl from the group into having sex and then emotionally abuses her when she rejects. But it's the girl who then suffers because the killer is focused solely on this one skewed moral code, which makes the deaths feel excruciatingly bleak instead of gratifying. Hell, Kim's boyfriend in particular shows genuine guilt for what happened, and Kim even forgives him, but in the killer's world, there's ultimately no going back. The debt still has to be paid, so to speak. Now, despite the motive we established earlier, it's still never made explicitly clear that it is the genuine motive. It's only in the last minute or two of the film does it actually confirm it, because as previously mentioned, up until that point, we have this whole other subplot involving the police searching for the psychotic sex offender. The gist of this setup is that the offender was accused of killing Robin and ended up disfigured in a fire after being chased by the police, and so you have this lieutenant who literally spends the entire film standing around making phone calls to see if the cops have located him, causing the lieutenant to miss the murders happening practically around the corner. To be blunt, the whole thing is a red herring. It exists simply to create urgency and add an air of doubt over the identity of the killer. Yes, there is an escaped murderous offender, and yes, he does kill some random girl off screen. However, when the prom finally comes to an end, he's seemingly caught off screen, having been discovered in another town miles away. I would not say it's pointless by any means. It does legitimately throw you off guard, as most pre-era slashers from the 70s like Black Christmas, Halloween, and The Town That Dreaded Sundown all employed a sense of realistic randomness and unpredictability, because the reality is, sometimes people kill because they kill, and there's no big grand meaning or conspiracy as to why. As Randy in Scream would say,
"Motives are incidental."
Now, before I talk about the killer himself, I do want to go back to a detail I mentioned in the beginning regarding the male gaze. Throughout the runtime, there are countless acts of subtle perversion and objectification towards women, or at least it calls attention to leering behaviour, even from the camera itself, making it constantly off-putting and distrusting, while also creating this distinct edge where it's not just about the characters being oblivious to danger, but showing how normalized their vulnerability is. While sexual promiscuity was yet to be highlighted as a genre staple, here that notion of sex equating to death or having a superstitious connection to it is incredibly common, further reinforcing how much of an influence this film likely had on Elm Street. In fact, the more I think about it, Prom Night and Elm Street have many visual thematic similarities. For example, when the prom finally commences, there's this dazzling fantastical contrast between the free-spirited teens having the time of their lives and the dark, creepy corridors of the empty high school. Hell, just like how Elm Street created sanctuary in being awake and the inevitable danger in dreams, the prom essentially becomes the perfect sanctuary for safety, the Jaws-esque proverbial stay out of the water, where death comes to those who venture outside its boundaries. Right, so this is the final stop before I give away the big killer reveal, so if you want to check out the film for yourself, you might want to skip this bit, but if you do want to hear my thoughts on the 2008 remake, you can do so by using the timestamps below. Frankly speaking, I really enjoy the killer's presentation. Yeah, sure, he's ultimately just some guy wearing a ski mask, but it's his aggressive, nimble energy that figuratively and literally propels him as a force of evil, which reminded me of The Town That Dreaded Sundown, as well as Scream's approach to humanizing the clumsy killer. He just throws himself at his victims without much of a game plan, even to the point of almost completely messing up and having his ass handed to him. It really tells us a lot about the personality behind the mask. It's pure, disorganized, adrenaline-fueled chaos. He's clearly emotional, panicked even, but that doesn't make him any less of a vicious wee fucker, because some of the deaths are truly unnerving without having to resort to gratuitous gore. The problem, however, is that Prom Night has one of the oddest, if indeed kind of expected, tonal shifts in the conclusion, where Robin's sister Kim and her boyfriend have this campy dance floor show-off before Kim fatally wounds the killer with an axe. The killer then stumbles outside where he's unmasked and is revealed to be Kim's brother Alex, who, as we expected, was seeking vengeance on the kids responsible for the death of his sister, before finally dying in his other sister's arms. It's one of those reveals that's very 50-50. If you weren't fooled by the red herrings, then you're likely going to suspect Alex because he practically disappears during the entire prom sequence, and it makes complete sense that if revenge was the motive, it had to be one of the family. But it was hardly going to be Kim or Mr. Hammond because they're constantly shown to be in the prom room, so it defeats the purpose of trying to make this reveal some sort of shocker. Personally, I still wish that the other killer subplot had some relevance in the conclusion, like maybe there were two sets of murders and they unintentionally overlapped and blended in with one another, and I don't know how serial killers communicate or coordinate, but that would have been some really awkward scheduling. Alright, so with the main event out of the way, let's take some time to talk about that 2008 remake, which, to be blunt, is one of the most boring slashers I have ever witnessed. While the original film is admittedly slow and sometimes uneventful in its middle third, it's at least delicately creepy and rewards your patience with a thrilling, cheesy 80s payoff. The remake, on the other hand, is just a soulless, vapid, modern reinterpretation that feels more like a slightly edgier Lifetime movie made by boomers blatantly out of touch with their younger audience. Maybe it's because I was still a few years off my prom life when I first saw it, but nothing about it felt exciting, energetic, or truly relatable in a way that reflected the generation it was meant to represent. Outside the prom itself, which now takes place in a hotel, the remake doesn't follow many of the original story beats, and even just straight up changes the main conflict in favour of its own grim setup. This time, we have a new final girl called Donna, who one night returns home to find her entire family murdered by an even more sinister threat in the form of her ex-biology teacher Richard, who later escapes from prison to track her down. Despite the harrowing circumstances, there is no getting past how laughably trashy it sounds, hence the Lifetime movie comparison. However, if I'm being painfully fair, there is something about this revision that does stick loosely within the spirit of the original. As I said earlier, the original feels ordinary and incidental. There's nothing unusual or unexpected about it, only this natural discomfort. It's just real life played out with the threat that something harrowing is about to happen. As such, having the killer just be some everyday teacher, a trusted member of a community who blends in like the rest of us, conceptually works incredibly well on paper. There's something inherently provocative about a killer who doesn't need to hide. I will not deny it's stylistically bland as all hell, but there is a believability to it, especially in scenes where he's able to use his chiseled, charismatic cheekbones to make people drop their guard so he can kill them easily. Look, I am not ashamed to admit that it is a novel idea because it demonstrates a level of natural vulnerability, particularly in the hotel setting where none of the rooms have cameras, thus making it much easier, and terrifyingly so, to get away with murder. We're so used to seeing films set in isolated motel settings, but a luxury hotel in the middle of town, you have to admit there is something kind of unnerving about that, because you should be surrounded by safety, but it's not still a guarantee. It's just a shame that the film fails to make any of that come across. These are unquestionably the lamest, most boringly forgettable kills in any slasher flick. At least the House of Wax remake, for example, was creative with its schlock. Here, almost every death happens in the same goddamn bedroom in the same goddamn way. It's egregiously repetitive, without anything to truly scare or provoke you, and even when it does try to add a few thoughtful touches like re-establishing the male gaze or Donna's PTSD, it just feels too much like a brief acknowledgement rather than something it sincerely wishes to explore. In fact, it does dabble slightly in teenage existentialism by having the characters reflect on their high school years and how far they've all come and so on, but it's difficult to feel anything when you're so alienated from every character. The movie just forgets to make you feel involved in their lives or care about their conflicts or relationships. I don't know who any of these people are. Why am I here? Why do I care? I want to go home. It's long past my bedtime. The whole thing just feels so empty and not in a meaningful way. The one flicker of tragedy it does have is when the hotel is evacuated following the murders and the most likable character Ronnie is waiting for his also most likable girlfriend Lisa, but he has no idea that she's long dead. I guess if the remake improved on one thing, it's arguably the detective, because firstly, having Idris Elba play him is a win by default, and secondly, he feels more urgent and relevant to the story. In fact, he actually gets to do something like mow down the fucking killer in the end. And that is Prom Night. I am aware there are 3 sequels that are supernatural to my knowledge, but I have not seen them, nor do I wish to see them, so if you have done so, please tell me about them in the comments below, and until next time, stay safe, stay away from evil proms, and I'll see you all very soon. Bye!